a lot of what I'm going to say has been said by others. No surprise there. But I'll talk about a third generation neutron powder diffractometer and GSAS and how much of my career has been also mentored by Bob. So we'll start with this project. I just had joined Peter Stevens's lab. And the first recall program that I learned how to use was not GSAS. It was actually full prof. But then he handed me a bunch of neutron data and said, oh, you know, me and my previous student collected this data at ISIS, but we never really finished the refinement. And maybe you want to have a try at it. I said, OK, great. What do I use? Because, you know, I couldn't figure out how to do time of flight with full prof. And he said, Bill David had some codes, but it's very hard to understand how it works. You might want to try GSAS, and here's a copy. So I saw a lot of people show the copy of GSAS manual. That's how I learned GSAS as well. I read through the manual and tried to figure out how to refine powder diffraction data, and my first paper was actually on neutron powder diffraction, even though I was working mostly at an X-ray lab. So here are some pictures of what I did, and again, no one will be surprised to hear rigid body was involved, soft constraints was involved, and there was a lot of other things that I needed to work, especially the profile functions, which are very, very different, as you heard from various different talks. They are different from what people are used to with X-ray machines or constant wavelength machines. So this paper has been shown by a couple of people, Von Dreele, Jorgensen, and Windsor from ISIS, or maybe it wasn't ISIS at that point, it was Harwell, right? It was Harwell. Yeah, okay. So I read that paper very carefully. It flew well over my head at that point, but I said, okay, let's go figure out the software. And I kind of muddled my way through and figured out which was the correct space groups for these materials. These are polymers. But then it was time to finish up graduate school and find a job. And Von Dreele was visiting us doing lysozyme at Peter's beamline. And Peter goes, maybe you want to work with Bob and go learn how to do some more neutron time of flight work. So I actually did have a lot of conversation with Bob, and I even wrote to Alan Hurd, who was at Los Alamos at that point. Then Bob mentioned that he was moving to Chicago. I said, Peter, who do you know at Chicago? So he said, well, Jim Jorgensen has been coming to the beamline to do a lot of work. Maybe you want to write to Jim. And Jim was kind enough to give my resume to various people at IPNS, and I ended up getting a job at IPNS. And guess what? Bob was sitting right across from the hallway. So I also, like Dave, could literally walk into his office and ask him questions, which was wonderful because I learned a great deal. The first thing I learned was essentially we upgraded the instrument, the GPPD instrument, and we were collecting a lot of data. And I wanted, like Sven, wanted to do a lot of refinements. In 2 days, we got all that pattern. And I went and asked Bob, how do I do the sequential stuff? He goes, okay, so this is my notes, actually, how to do it, because it wasn't available in GSAS. So he said, okay, you go do this. So I essentially took my notes, typed it up, and said, okay, I guess I have to write some codes. So I did write some code, and I ended up figuring out how to use macros, how to write text files and read them in, and copy and create this and do this whole bunch of sequential refinements. So published a couple of papers working on, again, hydrogen storage materials. But then Bob got interested in refining thousands of patterns with protein crystallography, and he wrote the sequential GSAS and handed me a CD with lots of protein data. It's like, okay, try this out and see if that works. So towards the end, and I was basically starting out at the spallation neutron source, working on the POWGEN project. And here is the only picture I could find. I also rummaged through my hard drive. And here is the workshop that was done to really invigorate the crystallography community. I think Brian and Jim Richardson and Bob probably organized it. It was primarily Brian. And we talked about how to go to the next step of GSAS, which was essentially GSAS-II. That's something that Brian and Bob were thinking about. And you will recognize some of the people who are standing in front of Advanced Photon Source during that GSAS-II workshop. Okay, so now I'm at spallation neutron source. I have all these beautiful diffractometers, which costs, as Ed mentioned, quite a lot more than Hippo did. But we don't have software support. So hardware was something we knew how to build, and we built these 4 beautiful diffractometers, 2 of them primarily powder, 2 primarily single crystal, and we needed help to do some more software development. And so for about 2 years, I worked very closely with Bob and Brian and convinced my management, which some of you might know was not very easy to do, to partially support Bob and Brian to include the time of flight features in GSAS-II. So I actually found the documents.
It's all Bob, by the way.
Right. You came in and visited a couple of times to help me convince my management. So yes, this was actually said, and this is the document where I essentially highlighted the expertise of Bob Von Dreele is required to achieve the task listed below. So that's what it took for us to get GSAS-II and time of flight playing together. So I managed to sort of inherit a project which was a slight deviation from how neutron powder diffractometers were designed. As you've heard, this is multi-bank, and because the fact that spallation neutron source was a very high frequency source, and to develop a high resolution or sort of high resolution diffractometer, we had to go far away, about 60 meters out. So this was a new concept of a 3rd generation diffractometer. So in a time of flight machine, you have a constant resolution over relatively narrow bands, right? Like the ones that we have seen in the previous talks. And the constant wavelength version, we have a variable resolution, but a relatively low Qmax. So the idea was to combine these 2 things and make a diffractometer at a time of flight machine, which had varying resolution, but had 1 bank. So this was done based on this equiangular spiral, which allows you to do that, which had variable resolution, large D spacing, and high Qmax. Okay, so what does that look? You get the giant mess of data with all the pixels that you have. We had now, essentially, we moved away from helium tubes, and we had scintillator detectors, which had pixels, and then you had to go and figure out how to time focus them all, sum them, fit them, etc. And some of the old things that we were used to using from the papers that were still valid for the peak shape, like you have the alpha and the beta term, but the dependence of the alpha and the beta term and some of the time of flight conversion to D-spacing was no longer working so well. So this is something that I did a lot of peak fitting. Bob did a lot of peak fitting. And then we eventually said, okay, we still use the same profile function because it still holds because we are on a co-moderator. But we add a couple of terms. And so this was Bob and I working on the POWGEN peak shape. And we ended up adding some additional terms. And if I remember this right, and Bob can correct me, he mentioned that even the other diffractometer data fit better with the additional parameters. Yeah. So yes, so this was a really big project that allowed my users to use this unique diffractometer to analyzing the powder diffraction data. So then I had a slight shift in my career, and I went to work at a place that might be well known to people. No, I did not have an office there, but I did get to visit the Apple Park.
It's not a synchrotron?
Rumor has it. They actually joke about that even at Apple.
I synchrotron.
So, as usual, Bob and I have had lots and lots of email exchanges. As other people's have had, he'd always tell me, oh, go check again. That was the first response. The second one, okay, send me the files. So I'd send him the files, and then we'll go over back and forth, and eventually we solve the problem. Sometimes I miss something. Sometimes he goes, whoa, you found a bug. So when I moved over to Apple, I got a one-liner from Bob. He said, good luck in your new job. Apple in California, use GSAS-II at Apple. Okay, so yes, I did. And Bob got lots of emails from me, even when I was at Apple, and everybody at Apple goes, you know Bob? I'm like, sure. We've worked together for quite some time now. And one thing I learned in industry is you do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, right? And you don't want to do that manually. So we actually used the Python programming feature where we essentially wrote everything that we did over and over again and could hand it over to a technician who could just collect the data, analyze the data, and generate that table that people were interested in. So that was a wonderful feature that we could write Python code and use GSAS-II.
I'll take that, thank you.
All right. So I come to the end of my talk, and I just wanted to wish happy birthday to Bob. And thank you very much for all of your support over the years in my career.